Before horror stories were told to frighten children, before people imagined the strigoi as monsters lurking in the dark, there was a very different time. A time when humans lived so close to nature that every gust of wind, every flicker of light, every shift of the seasons felt like a whisper they tried to understand. And on late autumn nights, when the cold breeze slipped through the thatched roofs as if calling someone's name, the people of the Balkans would gather around the fire and share the old tales, not to stir fear, but to feel closer, safer, within the vast darkness. The Balkan night was long and gentle, like the breath of the forest. Outside, the fields lay beneath a thin veil of mist, wooden rooftops lining the dirt road in silent rows. From afar came the faint bark of a dog, then everything fell quiet again. There was a strange beauty in that calm, like the whole world had paused, making room for something softer to enter. Inside the small houses, firelight flickered across the walls. People sat together, hands wrapped around warm wooden cups, eyes following the dancing flames. Every family had someone who would say, long ago, when the night was deeper than it is now, they believed certain souls still lingered nearby, not to harm anyone, only because they weren't ready to leave this world. And so the story would begin. No screams, no gruesome scenes, only a low, steady voice, as if each word were being placed gently on the wooden table. The elders spoke of the first winter they could remember, of standing outside and watching their breath dissolve into the freezing air. They remembered nights when sudden winds rattled every corner of their little homes, and in those moments, they said they always sensed something not clear, not frightening, just the familiar passing presence of someone gone, carrying memories with them. To them, the world wasn't divided sharply into the living and the dead the way we imagine today. Everything was softer, blurrier, blending together like moonlight and mist. They believed that sometimes the spirits of loved ones simply came back to glance at the old house, to make sure the hearth was still burning, to hear the quiet laughter of their descendants. And because of that, the night was not so frightening. It became a time for remembering, for connection, a space where people realized they were never truly alone. The storyteller would lower their voice, careful not to disturb whatever gentle presence might be outside. On nights like this, they would say, the old ones did not fear the dark, they respected it. And when the wind brushed softly across the roof and the fire leaned slightly to one side, you could understand why. Not because the darkness held something terrifying, but because it still held countless stories yet to be told. Stories that begin right here, in the quiet Balkan night. As autumn slipped quietly toward winter, the Balkan sky grew deeper and colder. The air carried the scent of damp earth, of recently harvested fields, of wind drifting down from distant mountains. To the people of long ago, this was the moment when the entire year seemed to slow. They felt, almost physically, the light retreating earlier each day, while the darkness lingered longer. Fear didn't always take the shape of a mysterious figure in the night. Sometimes it was simply the shifting of seasons, the weather turning, the great natural cycle that humans could never command. Back then, the people of the Balkans lived far closer to the land than we do now. They sowed by the sun, reaped by the wind, and rested when night fell. And so, whenever winter approached, they felt themselves growing smaller. The dark made everything quieter. Dirt roads that bustled with life in summer now stretched empty and endless. Windows were only a few steps apart, yet when the snow began to fall, each home seemed as distant as a world of its own. In that stillness, the human imagination sharpened. Every sigh of wind against the wooden walls, every faint clink of metal outside, every soft step of a night animal could spark a question. Is someone, or something, passing by? But these questions were not asked with panic. They were whispered low, almost soothing, as if spoken only to oneself. To the old folk, the darkness wasn't just the black space beyond the window. It was another world, a place they believed held gentler, more sensitive beings than humans. They imagined that sometimes the old spirits, the loved ones who once slept on these same beds, who once walked across this same earth, might drift back just to look around, not to frighten, only to stay connected to the life they once belonged to. Fear, then, took on a very different shape. It wasn't sharp like a blade or loud like a storm. It was more like a sudden chill when you step onto the porch at dusk, like the feeling of standing alone in a dark room but somehow sensing a strange, comforting peace, as if you weren't truly alone at all. At times like that, the elders gathered the children closer to the fire. They shared ancient legends, fragments of memory passed down through generations. No one questioned whether the stories were true. Truth mattered less than the warmth they brought to a cold night. And in those stories, the Strigoi did not appear as a terrible monster. The Strigoi was simply a symbol of winter, of sickness, of loss, the things people could not explain centuries ago. Seen that way, fear didn't make the darkness frightening. It gave the darkness depth, breath, a history, a gentle kind of fear, like a soft shadow walking behind you, never touching you, simply keeping pace until sunrise. And so the tales of the Strigoi, though wrapped in supernatural tones, were never meant to terrify. They were meant to remind us that across countless generations, humans have always found ways to turn fear into something understandable, something bearable, something that could be told on a cold night to make the heart feel just a little lighter. When someone left this world, the old Balkan people did not believe they vanished at once. They believed in a gentler journey, a slower transition, a span of time during which the soul remained close, walking through familiar places, quietly looking upon beloved faces one last time. This belief did not frighten them. It softened death, made it less abrupt, as if every farewell came with a small cushion of time for the heart to understand and accept. In the first days, after someone passed, the house was kept very still. Voices were lowered, footsteps softened, and the light was made warm. Not because they feared waking something, but because they believed the soul of the departed was still near, listening to the familiar sounds of home. Small, tender rituals were performed. People lit tiny candles, placing them in corners or on window ledges. Their wavering glow was seen as a doorway of light, helping the soul feel less lost when darkness fell. Mirrors were covered not out of fear, but because they believed the fragile soul might catch sight of its own reflection and think it was still alive, longing to return. Some families placed a piece of bread or a small cup of wine by the door, simple offerings that whispered, "If the road ahead is long, rest here for a moment. The home is still here. We still remember you." The first nights were always special. Loved ones stayed awake together, never leaving the body alone. They talked, shared memories, retold the stories the departed once told. Sometimes someone would pause, glance at a dim corner or a window, then smile softly, as if sensing something, a breeze, a shadow, a presence that felt gentle. To them, this was not a strigoi, not something frightening. It was simply a soul not yet far, a familiar warmth still lingering in the house, a shadow that once stood by the doorway every evening. They believed that over 40 days, the soul slowly loosened its final ties to the world, as if the departed needed time to step fully through a great doorway, and the living needed time to learn how to go on without that familiar voice, that laughter, those footsteps. Strangely, in that silence within that space between the two worlds, the strongest emotion was not terror, it was longing. Some nights, someone would say they dreamed of the departed sitting beside their bed, saying nothing, simply watching them with kindness. Those dreams made them wake with a sense of ease, as if an unfinished farewell had been completed with a soft, final touch. Only when a soul lingered too long, when sorrow or attachment became too heavy, did the old people begin to worry that perhaps the spirit had lost its way. And from that gentle worry, the the stories of Strigoi began to take shape, not as monsters, but as a reminder that sometimes even a soul needs to be guided home. In the ancient beliefs of the Balkan people, not every soul departed cleanly. Some were too bound to life, too full of love for their family, or burdened by something unfinished. Their journey slowed. They remained between two worlds, belonging fully to neither the living nor the dead. The old people called it the back of the darkness, a place where unresolved things drifted softly like mist. This idea was never meant to be frightening. In fact, it made death feel closer, more human. For if the departed could linger a little, revisit the places they cherished, then a farewell was no longer absolute. They believed a soul wandered not out of malice, but out of sorrow, out of longing, because it was simply not ready to step to the other side. On quiet nights, when families gathered by the fire and spoke of those who had passed, they sometimes felt the room warm slightly, or saw a door tremble though no wind blew. Such things didn't unsettle them. They took them as signs, gentle reminders that the soul was listening, learning that it was time to say goodbye again, this time more peacefully. But there were moments when the soul's sorrow grew too heavy. The elders believed that when this happened, the spirit might linger longer than it should, unsure of where to go, unsure of where it belonged. They described it with soft images: a pale shape standing in a doorway, footsteps light as raindrops on the roof, the sense of someone passing by the bed as you slept. This was the threshold where the legends of the Strigoi first began to take form, not out of terror, but out of concern that a soul was suffering, that it was wandering without guidance, and the sadness of that soul, as the old stories say, could sometimes seep into the living through heavy dreams, through strange waves of loneliness in the night. But imagine it as they did, not a creature prowling through the darkness, but a familiar spirit standing on your porch, looking in, hoping someone would notice, understand, and help them find the way. That is why the tales of lost souls were always told in quiet, slow voices. The village elders never screamed or tried to frighten the children. They spoke in low tones, as if reciting memory, aiming to kindle empathy rather than fear. In folklore, when a soul clung too tightly for too long, when longing and attachment turned into chains, people worried it could become an unbalanced being, a shadow between two worlds, unwilling to leave, but unable to stay. And this was the very foundation of the Strigoi, not as an enemy, but as a soul calling for help, a spirit needing guidance to release what remained and return to peace. The gentleness with which the old people viewed wandering souls turned the Strigoi into a lesson rather than a warning. It taught that the most frightening thing was not the darkness itself, but a soul unable to find where it belongs. And to guide such a soul, the living must keep the fire lit, keep the light steady, keep kindness alive like the small candles that once glowed through the winter nights of the Balkan hills. In the small villages scattered across the Balkans, people didn't look at life only with their eyes. They looked with intuition, with a sense of connection to the land, and with stories carried across generations. So when a child was born, they didn't simply check if the baby was healthy. They listened for strange signs, signals they believed the earth sent along with this new life. One of the most often whispered signs was a child born with the amniotic call covering its head. To modern medicine, it's nothing unusual, but to the people of old, that thin membrane was like a veil from another place, a curtain the soul had brought with it while crossing between worlds. The elders would murmur gently, "It didn't come alone, it brought something with it," not to frighten anyone, but to suggest that this child might, throughout life, be more sensitive to the unseen world than most. They didn't see it as a bad omen. On the contrary, many families believed such children possessed deep intuition, able to notice what others missed: subtle changes in the weather, the moods of animals, the faint sensation that something in the air had shifted. Many of them grew up to be herbal healers, quiet observers with eyes that understood feelings, or simply people whose presence brought calm to everyone around them. There were also children born during strange hours, moments the old people believed lay at the fragile border between day and night. It might be when the sun had just slipped below the horizon but darkness hadn't arrived, or when the night still clung to rooftops but the edge of the sky already glowed with dawn. These were crossing hours, when the two worlds might brush against each other. A soul born in such a moment, they believed, carried within it the sensitivity of both light and shadow. Stories like these were always told slowly, softly, especially when someone held a newborn in their arms. The adults kept their voices low, as if afraid to disturb something still tender within the child. They would say, "Some children are born to walk softly between two worlds." They didn't mean the child was destined for misfortune, only that it needed a deeper, gentler kind of care. But human beings naturally seek meaning in what they can't explain. And over time, these signs were embroidered into tales whispered only near the fire, as if speaking too loudly might burden the child with a fate it never asked for. Some even believed that if such a special child grew up surrounded by too much sorrow, its soul could become heavy, more easily lost when it eventually left this world. From these simple, tender beliefs, the early thread of the Strigoi stories began to form, not as punishment, but as a reminder that some souls are more fragile, more permeable, more in need of guidance. They saw these signs not with fear, but with compassion. They believed every life came with its own story, and it was the duty of the living to protect that delicate beginning until it grew strong enough to stand fully in this world. In the small villages scattered across the Balkan valleys, where mountains and hollows fold into one another like the creases of an old blanket, people passed down a very particular story about children born under rare circumstances, the seventh son in an unbroken line of sons. To the modern mind, it's simply a quirk of large families, but to the old folk, it was seen as a message from the world itself, a tiny key that unlocked a door between two realms. They never looked at such a child with fear. Quite the opposite. In many villages, the birth of a seventh son was considered a blessing. Elders said these children were born with eyes that can listen to the wind, with sharp intuition, and an ability to sense shifts in the air before anyone else noticed. They could soothe minor illnesses with herbs, detect an approaching storm from the way the late-day light dimmed, or calm someone's troubled thoughts with nothing more than a gentle hand on the shoulder. But every gift carries both brightness and shadow. In the tales told beside the hearth, people believed the seventh son carried two currents within him, one belonging to the living, and another flowing from that softer, mist-filled realm where wandering spirits drift like morning fog. Not a curse, only a heightened sensitivity that made the child more easily touched by sorrow or unease lingering around him. So families with a seventh son cared for him with exceptional tenderness. They avoided letting him sleep alone on stormy nights. They told him cheerful stories instead of melancholy ones. And they taught him ways to keep his spirit calm, because they believed that if such sensitive children grew up amid turmoil or loneliness, their souls could become heavier than those of others. From this belief emerged a small thread connecting to the tales of wandering spirits, ideas that eventually shaped the concept of the Strigoi in Balkan tradition. The elders used to say, "A sensitive soul, if it leaves this world without anyone easing its hurt, may have trouble finding the way." It was never spoken to frighten. It was a reminder to care for one another while still alive, so grief wouldn't cling to someone in the afterlife. As they grew, seventh sons often became the ones the village sought whenever something unexplainable happened. A strange noise, an unsettling dream, or the feeling that someone had just walked out of an empty room. They were seen as gentle bridges between the living and the unseen. And when those gifted souls eventually left this world, people always honored them with a careful, tender farewell ritual. Not out of fear that they might become Strigoi, but because the villagers believed that special souls, those who had always walked lightly between two worlds, needed to be guided onward with light, with blessings, with lullabies soft as a wind's breath. In this understanding, the Strigoi was never a monster. It was an idea, a symbol of a soul that had lost its way. And the seventh sons, sensitive, perceptive, kind, were thought to be the ones who understood that fragility best. Because sometimes, only those who carry a little of the night within their heart know how to bring light back to a wandering soul. In the old Balkan tradition, when someone in the village had just closed their eyes for the last time, the family's first duty was not burial. It was to prepare the vigil night. More than a ritual, it was a profoundly human, profoundly gentle moment, a way to keep the light close to a soul preparing to leave this world. In small wooden homes with thatched roofs, candles were placed in every corner of the room, not to ward off something frightening, but to illuminate the path for the departing soul. People believed that light, even a trembling candle in the dark, kept the soul from feeling alone, kept it from feeling abandoned. No one left the body unattended. They sat around the bed or the temporary coffin, speaking softly as if afraid to disturb something delicate drifting through the room. At times they laughed at old memories. At times they recalled stories that made everyone smile. And sometimes they simply sat still, listening to the wind slip through the cracks, feeling the night's chill settle bit by bit. The elders said the vigil night was when the living offered their final message to the soul, not through loud words, but through presence, through warmth, through refusing to let the room fall into a silence too heavy, through keeping the light close right beside the moment of departure. Throughout that long night, there were tiny moments. A curtain stirring with no breeze, a soft pop in the wooden floor, a fleeting sense of someone passing behind you. The people believed these were not frightening signs. They were the soul listening, watching, trying to whisper its own farewell. Because the soul was still near, small acts of care were performed almost instinctively. Mirrors were covered so the spirit wouldn't be startled by its own reflection during this fragile, in-between state. A cup of water or a piece of bread was placed nearby, as if the soul too had a long journey ahead and might need something to take along. No one cried loudly. Tears fell, but quietly. The Balkan people believed that wails of grief might pull the soul back, leaving it torn between love and departure, and so their sorrow was kept inward, while outwardly they offered calmness and gentleness, so the soul could leave in peace. If children were present, they were put to sleep in another room, always with an adult by their side. Children, the elders said, had sharp intuition and could easily sense a lingering soul, but they didn't want the little ones frightened. They wanted their world to stay soft for a while longer, not yet filled with shadows and loss. As dawn approached, as the first pale light swept across the rooftops, people would open the door a little to let the morning breeze in. They believed the wind carried blessings from the hills, helping the soul feel lighter, helping it cross the final threshold. The vigil night was never about fear. It was a moment of love, of gentle parting, of gratitude, a way of telling the soul, "You are not leaving alone. We will keep your path lit." And in that tenderness lies the earliest foundation of the Strigoi stories, not as a threat, but as a reminder that even souls need light to find their way back to peace. In the old Balkan villages, people believed that sometimes the soul of the newly departed lingered like the last guest at a long evening gathering, reluctant to stand and leave. And when such a soul remained nearby, the first sign the living felt was not violent or frightening. It was simply a heavier sleep than usual. The elders said that on certain nights, even if you drifted off easily, your mind felt held somewhere in between a hazy, suspended space, half dream, half waking. In that dream, you didn't run, you didn't scream, you didn't see anything terrifying. You only sensed someone calling your name from a very distant corner, not urgent, not demanding, just a low voice wrapped in the wind, sounding like a relative you've known your whole life. The people of old believed such dreams were messages from a lingering soul. They weren't afraid of them. Instead, they saw them as a moment to listen, a sign that perhaps the soul had something left to say, a final reminder to give, or simply a desire to be remembered for a little longer. The next morning, those who had such heavy dreams often woke with the feeling of carrying a small cloud inside them, a faint sadness with no clear origin. They would sit on the porch, watching the mist dissolve, and quietly wonder, did someone visit me last night? And in that atmosphere, other subtle signs sometimes appeared. A chair slightly out of place, a door trembling though the air was still, the flame on the hearth swaying as if someone had just walked past. To the modern eye, none of this is strange. But to those who lived in a world where nature and spirit blended together, these were signals as gentle as fingertips touching water. Some families said that on such nights, the children tossed and turned more than usual, as if sensing what adults could not see. The elders believed children had a second sight, a natural intuition that let them feel the presence of a soul that had not yet gone. If that presence lingered for several days, the family never panicked. They didn't flee the house or shut the windows to keep something out. They often did the opposite. Opened the door, lit an extra candle, placed a small piece of bread on the windowsill, not to keep the soul, but to offer warmth, to remind it that it was loved, and that it was time to follow the path toward peace. The old Balkan belief was simple. When a soul feels heard, understood, and gently acknowledged, its sadness becomes lighter, and when its sadness lightens, it can continue its journey. Only when the heavy sleep stretched into prolonged exhaustion, only when a household felt the darkness growing thicker than the light, only when the soul's sorrow became a burden on the living, only then would they whisper that perhaps the wandering spirit had lost its way for too long. And that is where the Strigoi legend first touches the story, not with snarls or shadows, but with a heavy sleep, a quiet sorrow, and a soul softly calling for help in the night. In the old Balkan way of life, nothing was more intertwined with humans than the animals they kept close to home. Dogs, cats, horses, goats, they all lived alongside the family, slept beneath the eaves, heard the laughter of children, and watched the seasons turn year after year. And so the elders believed that animals could sense the unseen world long before humans could, especially when the soul of someone recently departed was still lingering around the house. This idea was never frightening to them. It was like watching a cat suddenly stare intently into empty space, or seeing a dog stop barking and quietly perk its ears toward the darkness. These reactions were not warnings of danger. They were signs that nature was shifting, sending out a small signal that human senses hadn't yet caught. The elders often said, if a soul was still nearby, the horses would feel it first. Horses were naturally attuned to changes in the air and subtle movements of energy. A calm horse might suddenly startle, stomp the ground, or turn its head toward an empty corner. But instead of fearing it, people would rest a hand on the horse's neck, stroke it gently, reminding it that everything was all right. They see what our eyes can't, the elders would whisper, and that's just a natural part of the world. Dogs reacted differently. They didn't howl fearfully like modern ghost stories suggest. In the old Balkans, a dog would simply sit still, ears turned toward the doorway or a dark corner of the yard, as if listening to someone passing by. Some believed the dog was making sure the soul wasn't alone when crossing the yard for the last time. Not a warning, just a quiet greeting. Even small animals like cats or chickens had their subtle reactions. A cat rising and switching places. A hen suddenly going still in the middle of the night. Everything moved gently, like the forest breathing differently when the wind shifts. In moments like these, some villagers said they all sensed the same thing. The night felt slightly different, not colder, not darker, just quieter, as if nature itself was holding its breath for a soul taking one last walk through the world. And in that hush, the animals became the first watchkeepers, seeing and hearing what humans sensed only through intuition. No one in the village saw these signs as threats. On the contrary, they believed that if animals reacted, it meant the soul was passing peacefully, carrying no anger, no confusion. In Balkan belief, only souls burdened by deep sorrow or inner turmoil lingered too long. Most souls, especially those who had been loved, stayed only briefly, like the faint smoke left after a fire goes out. But if the signs continued, if the horses refused to approach the house, if the dogs refused to sleep in the yard, if the cat stared at the same dark corner night after night, then the villagers began to worry that the soul might be struggling to find its way. Even then, they didn't scream or panic. They didn't imagine a monstrous presence. They only whispered to one another, "Someone is not ready to leave." And in those whispers, the idea of the Strigoi moved one step closer, not as a fearsome creature, but as the soul of a loved one trying to find its way through two overlapping worlds, soft and pale as the Balkan morning mist. In the old Balkans, every village was like one large family. When something happened to one person, everyone knew. And when a household began showing unusual signs, heavy sleep that lingered for days, horses shying away from the doorway, dogs refusing to enter the yard, or a strange heaviness in the air, people paid attention, not out of curiosity, but because they understood that the sorrow of a lingering soul could spread quietly through an entire community. The elders were always the first to notice. They would pass by someone's gate and pause a little longer than usual. They would look at the roof, at the glow of the window, then give a small nod, as if sensing something the younger ones couldn't yet feel. No one spoke loudly. No one knocked on the door to demand answers. In the Balkans, worry traveled in glances, in slight nods, in silences that carried more meaning than any words. And when many families began to feel the same things, heavy dreams, footsteps in the hall at night, or a chair shifting softly for no reason, the villagers understood that this was no longer a private matter. This was a collective signal, a whisper from the other world, not meant to frighten, but to ask for guidance. In the late afternoons, as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, people gathered in the shared courtyard or by the village well. Everyone spoke softly, as if the darkness itself were listening. One person said they felt someone walk across their porch the previous night. Another mentioned hearing a door tremble, though the air was still. Someone else said their dog sat staring at the same corner of the yard for far too long. Each tale was a puzzle piece, and when fitted together, the village saw the larger picture. It wasn't just any soul that was lost. It was a soul sending stronger and stronger signals, struggling to leave this world. What mattered most was how the Balkan villagers responded. No one screamed or fled. They didn't think of demons or impending doom. Instead, they felt responsible, as if this wandering soul were knocking gently on every door, hoping someone would understand. Their worry was tender, deeply human, like seeing an old friend return to the village wearing a sad expression, unable to say what they needed, but everyone knowing instinctively what to do. When the signs grew clearer, the villagers visited the family most affected, not to judge or interrogate. They brought fresh bread, a bit of wine, or a new candle. They sat with the grieving family in quiet companionship, making the home warmer, brighter, because in their belief, light and unity were the strongest forces guiding a soul toward its next step. And if even that gentle presence did not fade, the village knew it was time for the next step. Not some dreadful ritual, but an important conversation. Was this soul merely sad and hesitant, or had it begun to drift truly astray? When that question settled into every heart, the legend of the Strigoi grew one step deeper. Not the monstrous Strigoi of modern stories, but the ancient meaning, a soul that loved its family too deeply to let go. And if that soul stayed too long, if it made the living weary, if the darkness in a home grew thicker than the light, then the village understood they had to help it find the path again, slowly, gently, with all the respect owed to someone who once lived, laughed, and walked these same dirt roads, just like them. In the ancient Balkans, long before the Strigoi became a whisper in the dark, long before people spoke of wandering souls or heavy, dream-laden nights, there existed a belief far older, far deeper, the faith of Zalmoxis. It was the spiritual ground from which all later stories grew, like grasses rising from old, ancestral soil. The Dacians, the ancient people living among the mountains surrounding the Balkans, believed that death was not an ending. To them, death was simply stepping through a doorway. You did not vanish. You only entered another room within the same cosmic house. And in that room, Zalmoxis, the revered deity, waited to receive you. This belief made the Dacians remarkably unafraid of death compared to many cultures. They saw it as a long journey back home, where old friends and departed relatives stood in warm light, waiting. They said the dead did not leave forever. Souls could return, wandering back to look upon their homeland, their familiar rooftops, their winter hearth. That return was not an intrusion, it was a homecoming. This understanding blurred the line between the two worlds. The living and the dead did not exist in opposition. They moved past each other, touched lightly, exchanged small signs. And from this worldview, the rituals of Balkan life covering mirrors, lighting candles, keeping vigil took root. These customs were never meant to repel spirits, but to support their journey, ensuring they did not lose their way. The Dacians once performed elaborate rites to send messages to Zalmoxis. Today, those rites might seem fierce, but to them, they were acts of reverence. Over time, such rituals softened, becoming the gentle practices you've seen throughout these chapters. A candle in the corner, a cloth over a mirror, a quiet room in the night. And from the belief that souls could return, came a very human worry. What if a soul forgets the way? What if it cannot find the door to Zalmoxis? Not because it is evil, not because it seeks harm, but because it is sad, because it clings too tightly to the world it knew. The Balkan people viewed such souls with compassion. They understood that even spirits could become trapped in their own longing, just as the living sometimes become trapped in memories they cannot release. And when a soul lingered too long, they gave it a name not of condemnation, but simply of description. Strigoi, not a demon, not an enemy, just a person who loved the living world too much to leave it behind. Because of this, the faith of Zalmoxis does not make the Strigoi story frightening. It makes it deeper, more beautiful, a lesson about love, longing, and the ways people try to guide one another back to the right path, even when that path lies beyond the thin, invisible door of death. This connection between the two worlds, between light and shadow, between the living and the gone, is the quiet undercurrent from which every Strigoi story flows. And once we understand that, we see that the myth was never about terror. It was always about helping a wandering soul find its peace again. When a soul could not yet step through the doorway to Zalmoxis, the old Balkan people did not turn to fierce rites or dramatic acts. Instead, they relied on small rituals, soft gestures, quiet and steady, to restore balance for both the household and the wandering spirit. They believed that light, warmth, and respectful actions could form the very path a soul needed to find its way forward. The first, and perhaps most familiar ritual, was lighting candles. A candle might be placed near the window, by the head of the deceased, or in the corner of the room where they believed the soul lingered before departing. The flame didn't just illuminate the dark, it was a message. Do not be afraid, this is still home. From here, you can find your way. The gentler the flame flickered, the more people believed the soul was moving through the space, listening closely. The second ritual was covering the mirrors. There was nothing ominous in this. The Balkan people believed that in the blurred moment between two worlds, the soul might look into a mirror and fail to understand that it had left its body. Such a moment could confuse the spirit and cause it to cling longer than it should. Covering the mirrors was not banishment, it was like dimming the lights for a saddened guest so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed. Alongside this, families placed a bowl of water, a piece of bread, or a small pinch of salt near the door, not to feed the soul, but to show hospitality. A welcomed, respected spirit found its heart lighter and thus easier to guide onward. Many believed that kindness, not charms, was the true key to helping a soul reach peace. During nights, when the presence lingered, family members would speak gentle blessings, soft as breath, not pleas, not expulsions, but simple words. We remember you. Be at ease. Your path is open now. These words were like small stones set along a trail, helping the spirit see where it needed to go. Elders sometimes burned rosemary or juniper, herbs thought to calm wandering souls. Their smoke drifted slowly, like a pale ribbon drawing a line between the two worlds. Wherever that scent spread, people believed there would be no turmoil, no fear, only the quieter soul needed to understand that its journey must continue. If after all these rituals the soul still lingered, the villagers didn't see it as failure. They simply believed the spirit carried a great sorrow, something still weighing on its heart. And when a soul is sad, the living must become gentler still. They avoided loud noises, arguments, anything that might thicken the air with heaviness. They moved more slowly, as if stepping briefly into the spirit's quiet realm, so that no one, living or dead, felt lost. Only when these small rituals could no longer ease the spirit's confusion did people begin to whisper that perhaps it was time for another step. Not stronger, but more solemn. A way to determine whether the soul had become a strigoi in its original sense, a spirit held too long by love and sorrow. But for now, in the candlelight, the covered mirrors, the bread and salt, the scent of herbs, there is no strigoi, only a soul searching for its path, and a village quietly keeping the light to guide it home. When the small rituals, candlelight, whispered blessings, rosemary smoke, salt and bread were no longer enough to ease a soul's confusion, the old Balkan villagers did not assume anything evil. They simply understood that the soul carried a sorrow too heavy, or a bond too deep, preventing it from moving on. And in such moments, the entire village needed a more delicate way to listen to understand more clearly what was happening. That was when they turned to the horse, the creature the Balkan people believed was more sensitive to the unseen world than any other. A horse was not just a companion or a means of travel. It was a being of instinct, of subtle perception, hearing what humans could not hear, seeing what humans could not see. The villagers believed a horse's eyes could detect the slightest tremor in the air, the soft presence of a soul still unsure of its path. And so the ritual of using a horse to locate a wandering spirit was never meant to be frightening. It was a rite of reassurance, helping the village understand what they were facing. On thick, misty mornings, the whole village gathered by the small hillside cemetery. No one spoke loudly, no one laughed. Every step was gentle, as if they feared disturbing the slumbering darkness below the earth. At the center stood a white or black horse. Its color had to be pure, unblended, for the villagers believed only such animals had spirits clear enough to sense a lost soul. A young boy or teenager was chosen to lead the horse. It was always a child with a quiet heart, no fear in his eyes. Someone the village believed carried little noise in his mind. The quieter the guide, the truer the ritual. Slowly, he walked between the graves. The horse followed, every step attentive, every breath listening. No one wished for the horse to stop. If it walked calmly past every grave, the message was simple. The soul had found its path. The home rituals had been enough. Peace had returned. But if the horse approached a specific grave and halted suddenly, its breath quickening or its head pulling back as if sensing something unseen, then the whole village understood that the soul was here, not as a dark presence, but as someone standing lost between two forests, someone who needed help. When the horse stopped, the elders stepped forward. They placed their hands on the stone and spoke softly, as if addressing an old friend. "We know you are here. We do not blame you. We will help you find your way." There were no threats, no fear, only respect for a soul unable to leave, yet causing no harm. To the Balkan villagers, this ritual was the fairest, gentlest test. They did not rely on rumors or uneasy feelings. They let nature speak, allowing an innocent creature to bridge the two worlds. And when the horse stopped before a particular grave, the villagers knew the soul needed a greater, more solemn ritual, not for punishment, but for release. To lead the soul out of the mist where it was trapped, guiding it through the final part of a journey it could not finish alone. But that greater ritual, demanding the courage of the entire village, was never done immediately. They always gave themselves a night to think, to pray, to prepare, because what they were about to do was not born from fear. It was born from responsibility, from compassion, from love for someone who had once lived among them. And in the moment the horse stopped at the grave, the legend of the Strigoi was no longer vague or distant. It became something real, gentle, sorrowful, a soul unable to let go, waiting for the village to guide it down the last stretch of its path. When the pure-colored horse stopped before a grave firmly but without fear, the entire village understood they were facing a truly wandering soul. Not a Strigoi in the modern sense, not a shrieking phantom, not a creature of horror, but simply a soul that had carried sorrow for too long, stayed for too long, until its lingering cold began to seep into the sleep and strength of the living. And from that moment on, everything in the village grew slower, quieter, not out of fear, but out of reverence, for they were about to take part in a great ritual, one meant to set a soul free. On the afternoon following the horse ritual, families closed their doors earlier than usual, not to hide from the spirit, but to preserve the quiet needed for the night of preparation. Candles were lit in every home, not bright enough to dispel the dark entirely, but soft enough to blur the edges of every shadow. At the large wooden table in the village elder's house, the oldest among them gathered. Every word was spoken low, each sentence weighed carefully. They did not speak of punishment or banishment. Such words did not belong to the old Balkan tongue. They spoke instead of release, guidance, showing the way, showing the way. The elder would begin in a slow, solemn voice. "The soul has stayed too long. We must help it." In the old Balkan villages, no major ritual was performed without first asking whether the family of the departed wished to take part. Even though the rite belonged to the community, the soul belonged to the family. No one wanted the spirit to feel exiled or betrayed by its own. The family often sat in silence for a long while, not out of hesitation, but to keep their emotions from overflowing. A mother might whisper, "If it remains because of us, we do not wish to hold it back any longer." And the father would nod, his tired eyes reflecting the candlelight. "We will do what must be done." In Balkan belief, this was the most crucial moment. The family's consent. If the family refused, the ritual was never performed, because they believed a soul would wander even more painfully if it felt rejected by its own blood. As night settled, villagers brought the items needed for the next day's great ritual. Small oil lamps, dried juniper branches, coarse white cloths, freshly baked bread, and a bowl of embers to carry the flame. Everything gentle in meaning, nothing violent. The elders instructed the younger villagers, "Tomorrow, there will be no shouting, no fear. We will simply guide a soul back to its path." Children were not hidden away from the ritual. They were taught that this was not something to fear, but a natural part of life. They watched their parents prepare calmly, and to them, the ritual looked like another important harvest day, not a battle against darkness. That night, no one slept deeply. Some polished the oil lamps. Some tied the ropes for the wooden boundary stakes that would encircle the cemetery. Some simply sat on their porches, listening to the wind glide over old rooftops. They did not fear the wind, for in its whisper, the soul might be listening too, waiting to be guided. And when the first light of dawn swept across the village, the Balkan people believed that this moment, standing at the threshold between night and day, was the perfect time to help a soul gather the strength for its final step. A step it could not take alone. A step the entire village, with gentleness and unconditional compassion, would take beside it. From this moment onward, the great ritual approached. The ritual that, across centuries, would become one of the earliest foundations beneath the legend of the Strigoi, known to the modern world. Before the sun fully rose just bright enough for people to see their path, the entire Balkan village made its quiet way up the small hill where the cemetery lay. No one spoke loudly. Every step was soft, as if they feared disturbing the fragile air drifting between night and day. Those moments the elders believed were the thinnest edge between the two worlds. In the pale blue light of early morning, the old stone markers looked like shadows standing in the mist. The pure-colored horse from the day before was there again, but this time it waited at the far end of the cemetery. Its role as guide was over. It had already pointed out the grave, and now the rest belonged to the living, through compassion, respect, and duty. The oldest villager stood at the front of the gathering, holding a small oil lamp. The trembling golden flame lit his face as he spoke, slowly and softly. Today, we help a soul find its way home. That was the beginning of the ritual. No pleading, no threats, just a promise, whole and peaceful. On the ground beside the grave, the one where the horse had stopped the previous day, the villagers laid out everything prepared the night before: a white cloth, dried juniper branches, freshly baked bread, a bowl of water, and a second oil lamp, brighter, placed directly before the gravestone. Nothing violent, everything symbolic of light, purity, hospitality, and an open path. The family of the departed was invited to stand closest. They were never excluded. They were the heart of the ritual. The mother placed her hand on the stone and whispered a final message, her voice trembling but steady. The father stood behind her, a hand on her shoulder, not to hold her back, but to share the weight of the moment. When all had gathered, the elder closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began the first step of the ritual, lighting the soul's path. He used a slender wooden stick to pass the flame from the first lamp to the next, then to the villagers on both sides. Soon, a long line of flickering lights stretched from the cemetery gate to the grave, a path made of fire, not bright, but warm. The Balkan people believed that no matter how lost a soul was, it could never ignore a light created by the community it once lived among. Such light did not force the soul to leave it, invited it. Next, they lit the juniper branches. The smoke rose slowly, pale and soft as a sigh. The villagers believed its scent calmed weary souls, helping them release whatever sorrow had held them back. When the smoke drifted higher, the elder laid the white cloth before the gravestone and spoke with a steady warmth. If you are confused, we give you the path. If you are sad, we give you light. If you still remember, we give you love. Go in peace. No kneeling, no obscure chants, only simple human words, like bidding farewell to a family member. After the light ritual came the final act, sharing bread and water. They placed the bread and the bowl of water before the grave, then passed small portions to everyone present. Sharing food was not meant for the soul itself, but to show, we are still connected. Even as you go, you remain one of us. In that moment, the soul was believed to understand that it was not forgotten, and therefore had no reason to remain. A soft breeze swept through the cemetery, cool, gentle, and the elders always took this as a sign, not of something supernatural and eerie, but as the signal of release, like someone exhaling after a long, difficult journey. The ritual ended with no drums, no cries. Everyone stood silently for a moment, then quietly walked back to the village. No one looked behind. According to Balkan belief, the soul would follow the path of light on its own. This was how the old villagers prevented a wandering soul from becoming a strigoi, not with violence, not with fear, but with compassion, light, reassurance, and a community standing together in stillness. Only gentleness for a soul trying to find its way home. After the dawn ritual, the Balkan villagers returned home believing, hoping that the wandering soul had finally found its way. And in many cases, that was exactly what happened. The lighted path, the farewell words, the scent of juniper smoke, all of it was usually enough to help a soul loosen its sorrow and continue its journey. But this time was different. That evening, the family's home became strangely quiet, not peaceful, but a silence that stretched too long, like an empty space waiting to be filled. The children fell asleep slowly, tossing, as if someone in their dreams had brushed a hand against their shoulder. The dog, silent for days, now stood at the door at night, no barking, only watching the darkness with alert, wet eyes. The candle that had burned all day, thought to have done its duty, suddenly flickered hard at midnight, though there was no wind. The mother whispered to her husband, "Do you feel that it hasn't left?" He didn't answer immediately. He only looked around the room, the gold light on the walls, unable to push back the shadow of something that felt like it was standing just behind an invisible door. The next morning, a neighbor visited and felt it too. The feeling was no longer vague. It had shape, weight, as if a soul were trying to move, but could not, as if its confusion, once soft, was beginning to thicken. Yet the villagers did not panic. They had lived long enough beside this invisible world to know that some souls simply needed more time. But they also knew that when the signs did not fade after a ritual, something was holding the soul more tightly than usual. That afternoon, a few young villagers walking near the cemetery noticed something strange. The ground before the grave still held a heavier layer of dew than anywhere else, as if the night wind had carried cold there and refused to leave. Small broken twigs lay near the stone, although no storm had passed. Nothing frightening, just small signs, enough to affirm what everyone already sensed. That evening, the village gathered again, not to debate extreme measures, not to discuss danger, but simply to listen, to see if everyone felt the same thing. An elder spoke softly. "This soul is heavier. There is something it has not let go." A young woman added, "I feel like someone is searching for something in that house, but can't remember where they put it." A man nodded. "When I passed by their home, I felt someone standing in the doorway, but not someone living. Still, no one felt threatened, and that calmness only made the air more solemn. They knew this soul was not angry, not harmful. It was simply more lost than before." Families began recalling what their ancestors had taught. There are souls that, no matter how kind the ritual, cannot leave if their sadness is deeper than what the living can understand. And this was the moment when the legend of the Strigoi edged closer, not as a lurking monster, but as the shape of a lonely presence quietly knocking on doors, hoping someone might hear it. The villagers understood that a soul lingering too long could affect the living, not by draining them like modern tales suggest, but through weariness that never lifts, nights that feel too cold, dreams so heavy that one wakes with a stone on the chest. This was when they said the soul was standing on the fragile border between one who hasn't gone and the original Strigoi, a wandering spirit so lost that its sorrow had begun to brush against the living. At this point, the villagers knew they had exhausted every gentle ritual they could offer. Now they needed the next step, a stronger, more solemn rite, yet still rooted in the same compassion and respect. Because when a soul becomes too lost, the only thing that can save it is stronger light and deeper kindness. When a soul lingered even after the great ritual, the old Balkan villagers did not immediately assume danger, but they knew its presence would begin to spill into everyday life in subtle, delicate ways, quiet signals showing that the soul was slipping deeper into the space between worlds, the place the elders called the threshold of the Strigoi. Not growls, not shadows darting past windows. Those are inventions of modern horror. In the old Balkans, the first signs of a strigoi were gentle shifts in the life of the people it once loved. In that family's home, heavy sleep turned into daytime exhaustion. The mother, normally a deep sleeper, now woke with the sense that someone had sat at the edge of her bed all night. No one saw anything, yet she felt something trying to stay. The father, sitting by the hearth, sometimes felt a cold, lingering presence behind him, not a jolt, just enough for him to turn around slowly, as if someone had laid a hand lightly on his shoulder. Children, always more sensitive, did not cry or panic, but they said things that made the adults fall silent. I dreamed someone was looking for something under my bed. Last night there was someone at the door, but I couldn't see clearly. Why does our house feel sad? Nothing frightening, just sorrow spreading through the house like moisture soaking into wooden walls. Animals reacted more clearly. The family's horse refused to drink from its usual trough, instead stopping several steps away, staring at the spot where candles often burned. The dog, instead of barking, sat facing a corner of the house, ears tuned toward a space no one else could see. To the Balkan people, these were not signs of danger. They were signs of unresolved pain. They believed that when a soul carried emotions too heavy, resentment, loneliness, grief, its energy could make the living tired, weakened, unwell. Not because the soul wished harm, but because without a body, it could no longer control its influence on the world around it. The word strigoi, in its oldest form, described exactly this: a soul that loved too long, remembered too deeply, and stayed too much, until it unintentionally drained the living through its sorrow. So when the mother began struggling for breath at night, when the father tended the fire only for the flames to keep dying out despite steady kindling, the village understood the truth. The soul was calling for help, not with anger, but with sadness. The most important thing was this: the Balkan people did not fear the original strigoi. They pitied it. They cared for it. They remembered it as someone who once laughed with them, worked with them, walked the same dirt paths. A soul trapped in its own longing. But they also knew that if this continued, the living would grow weaker, not from attack, but from being enveloped in the soul's warm, confused energy. And so the villagers knew the time had come to do what their ancestors had passed down, a ritual even stronger than the last, a ritual no longer made of candlelight and farewells alone, a ritual requiring the courage of the entire community and, if necessary, the presence of the village priest, whom they rarely consulted, but whose role became important when the balance between worlds began to shift. Not to punish, not to banish, but to help the soul poised at the brink of becoming a full strigoi finally find the peace it could not reach on its own. And so another gathering was called. At night, quieter than before, more solemn than before, yet holding one truth that never changed in the old Balkans. Compassion always came before fear, and now they had to decide whether it was time to speak to the village priest. When the father began to weaken, when the mother felt her breath tighten at night, and when the children woke with sad eyes, though no one had scolded them, the entire village knew the soul had wandered too far into confusion. This was no longer the gentle lingering of a loved one, no longer a soft final visit. It had become an unconscious clinging, and that clinging was wounding the very people the soul loved most. In moments like this, the old Balkan people remained calm. They did not panic, did not conjure images of terrifying ghosts, and did not twist the story into something dark. Instead, they gathered behind the village elder's house on a small patch of grass, bordered by mossy stone walls, a place where the most important decisions of the village had been made for generations. When everyone had taken their seat in a circle, the elder spoke. "We have done everything within human means, but this soul now needs stronger guidance." Slow nods followed, quiet sighs, and finally, the thought that had been sitting in everyone's mind became a spoken truth. It is time to speak to the priest. In the old Balkans, Priests did not interfere in every spiritual matter, especially not in those tied to ancient Dacian beliefs. The villagers respected the church, but they also understood there were truths belonging to the land, the forests, and their ancestors, things outside any scripture. They sought the priest only when a soul had reached the most dangerous threshold, when one more step could turn it into a complete strigoi, not the monstrous strigoi of modern tales, but the original kind, a soul that no longer knows which world is its own, wandering between realms, carrying endless sorrow. A small group walked toward the church at the edge of the village, near a stand of old chestnut trees. The church door was slightly open, candlelight spilling out across the stone floor. The priest was putting away his books when they arrived. He looked up, not startled, as if he had been expecting this night. The eldest villager bowed. "Father, a soul is trapped. We have done every rite of our ancestors, but it still cannot leave." The priest did not scold them for their folk rituals. He knew they were acts of love, not acts against the church. He simply asked, gently, "Does the family agree?" The elder nodded. "They are ready. They do not want it to suffer anymore." The priest stood, taking a long coat and a small wooden box containing sacred objects, an old wooden cross, a vial of holy water, and a thin, worn prayer book. He carried no threats, no wrath, only a prayer for peace. When they stepped outside, the moon was rising bright, soft. Its light fell across the dirt path like a pale silver cloth. The Balkan people believed that a moonlit night meant the veil between worlds was easier to adjust, a doorway already cracked open, waiting for someone to step through. When they returned to the family's home, the air had changed. The window was slightly ajar, as if someone had just stood there. The candle in the corner flickered harder than in nights before, its glow shifting like it wanted to speak. The priest entered, placing the wooden box on the table. He did not raise his voice. He gave no commands. He simply placed a hand on the father's shoulder and said, "We will bring it home." This was not a dramatic exorcism, not a battle between light and darkness. It was a moment where two spiritual traditions converged, folk belief and Christian prayer, working together for one purpose, to guide a lost soul back to where it belonged. And in that moment, the villagers understood that the next step would no longer be gentle like the rituals before, but it would still be done with compassion, reverence, and the soft glow of Balkan moonlight. The final ritual was about to begin, a ritual that would determine whether the soul would become a true strigoi or be released forever. When the priest placed the wooden box of sacred items on the table, the house grew so quiet, one could hear the breath of every person inside. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of a moment in which both worlds were listening. The father sat near the hearth, his hands trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes calmer than they had been in days. The mother stood close to the priest, her eyes red but no longer frightened. The children were led into the next room, though the door remained open so they would know this was not something to fear, but a natural part of life. The priest lit a tall ceremonial candle in the center of the room, a candle reserved for the most important rites. Its flame rose higher and steadier than the others. It burned straight, unshaking, like a column of light standing firm in the darkness. "Do not be afraid," he said gently. "The soul that lingers here is not an enemy. It is only lost." The villagers formed a circle around the candle. Some placed juniper branches from the earlier ritual on the floor, symbols that the old ways and the new could stand side by side. The priest opened the wooden box and took out the worn wooden cross. He did not raise it high or slam it against anything. He simply held it at chest height, as if offering it to the soul standing somewhere in the room. Then he began to pray. Not long, complex lines, but short, whispered sentences. "May the sorrowing soul find rest. May its path open before it. May the weights that hold it fall away. May it find home where the light begins." His voice flowed softly, like a lullaby sung by a mother beside a window on the first snowy night of winter. Nothing about it disrupted the folk atmosphere. It blended into it, as though the church's blessing and the ancestors' customs were standing together for one purpose. The mother began to cry, not the clinging kind of crying, but the kind one offers in farewell. The father placed a hand on her shoulder, quietly accepting that it was time. Together with the villagers, the priest walked to the grave on the hill. Dawn had not yet come. The sun was still hidden. Moonlight fell over the stone, pale and thin like a veil of mist. The villagers set small oil lamps around the grave, forming a soft ring of light. No one touched the earth. No one disturbed the grave, for to them, the original Strigoi was not something to destroy. It was a soul to be released. The priest sprinkled holy water 3 times, each time whispering, "Go home. Your path lies forward, not behind. You are not abandoned. We simply guide you onward." He placed the wooden cross before the stone, not to trap the soul, but to point the way. The village elders placed the final offering, a piece of bread and a bowl of water, at the base of the gravestone. "This is your last share, not to keep you here, but so you do not feel alone as you go." As the ritual neared its end, a stronger breeze swept across the cemetery. Not harsh, not biting, just strong enough to tilt the flames of the oil lamps. The pure-colored horse standing nearby let out a soft whinny, not frightened, only lifting its head as if watching something pass swiftly by. The priest closed his eyes, laid his hand on the cross, and spoke the final words. "Walk toward the light. This world has loved you enough. Now it is time for you to find your peace." A deep stillness followed. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. And then they all felt it. A release, like a single breath, gentle and dissolving into the air. Not a scream, not a shadow, just absence, a warm absence, like a space that had finally been filled by peace. When the villagers walked home, they did not look back. They didn't need to. They knew the soul was gone, and in that moment, they understood that a strigoi, when understood properly and guided at the right time, was never a curse, never a demon. It was simply a soul that once loved this life too deeply, and at last, it had been set free. After the final ritual, the villagers walked down the dirt path toward the valley in the softening light of early morning. No one spoke loudly. No one asked, "Did you see anything?" The Balkan people understood that some things are felt, not spoken, and one of those things was the warmth spreading softly through the village like heat returning after a long, cold night. When they reached their homes, hearth fires glowed again. Thin smoke curled from thatched roofs, weaving into the pale morning sky. The roosters began to crow, no longer silent as in the days before. The family's dog stepped onto the porch, sniffed the air, then lay down calmly, as if it could finally rest. The mother of the household stepped outside and drew a deep breath. For the first time in days, she felt no weight on her chest, no sense of someone standing near. The candle inside burned steady, its flame no longer wavering. The father sighed, but it was a sigh of release, not fatigue. The children ran into the yard, their eyes brighter, their laughter natural. No one needed to say it aloud, everyone knew. The soul was gone. The morning passed slowly, but brighter than any morning before. Even the wind felt different, carrying the scent of damp earth and new leaves. At the village well, faces reflected in the water were no longer shadowed by worry. One elder murmured, "We did not drive it away." Another smiled softly, "No, we simply opened the door for it." That was the way of the old Balkans. They did not believe they battled darkness. They believed they helped the light find its path. To them, this world and the next were not two opposing realms, but two rooms in the same great home. Sometimes the door between them stayed open a little too long, and the task of the living was to close it gently, not with fear, but with compassion. The priest returned to the church, placing the sacred objects back into the wooden box. Before closing the lid, he paused, whispering a final blessing, not a plea, but a farewell. "May you find the place where you belong." The villagers did not celebrate or feast, but they baked bread, shared it with neighbors, poured warm tea, and the morning drifted by in soft conversation, light as dust in sunlight. Fear had never united them, sharing did. By afternoon, as the sun cast pale gold across the fields, the family placed one last candle in the window, not to guide the soul anymore, but as a thank you, a goodbye, a wish for peace on its journey. And then night settled, a peaceful night. No shifting chairs, no sudden chills, no heavy dreams. Only the whisper of insects in the fields and the gentle breath of wind brushing the roof. In that tender darkness, the Balkan people believed they could sense the soul one last time, not nearby, but traveling far, fading into the horizon where both worlds meet. And in that moment, the story of the Strigoi, in its oldest, most human form, came to a close. No horror, no violent magic, no battle of good and evil, only people, light, and a soul that finally found its way home. In the Balkans, that was always the most beautiful ending a wandering soul could receive.